All right, everybody, let's do this thing. I am Drew McManus, the author of Adaptistration, and this is my podcast, Shop Talk, where I invite captivating guests to talk about engaging topics connected to the orchestra business. Today's captivating guests include a group of stakeholders from the Toledo Symphony Orchestra, and we're here to talk about one of my absolute favorite topics in the whole wide world, contracts. More to the point, we're going to talk about how this specific orchestra went about navigating the waters of COVID-era agreements and the changes they put in place. But before we jump into that, let's meet our 5 guests. And with a group of stakeholders like this, it's by far the most number of folks that we've had on the podcast at one time, so I'm not really sure exactly what to call a group like this. Is it a herd? Is it a gaggle? Is it a collective? Is it a murder? At the very least, we'll just stick with the quintet, if nothing else. But first up, we've got Board Chair Pat Bowe. Next, we have Zach Vassar, President and CEO. Next is Keith McWaters, who is the orchestra manager and percussionist. Amy Heritage, second flute and orchestra committee chair. And Elizabeth Rice, cellist and orchestra committee member. Hello, everybody. Thank you all very much for being here. Now, it's a really nice group and mix of folks. Now, I want to maybe get some perspective from each of your positions before we start so folks know where you're coming from. Let's start on the musician end of things. Elizabeth, how long have you been with the orchestra?
I just finished up my 3rd season.
Terrific. And Amy?
I've been second flute with the orchestra since 2005.
Fabulous. And Keith?
I've been with the orchestra since music was invented. I've been with the group since the late 70s.
Since the late 70s. And how about in your administrative role?
Early 80s.
Early 80s. And just as a quick aside, for folks who don't usually know this sort of thing about orchestras, what I'm talking about with Keith's administrative role is unlike the 2 other musicians we have here who are on the orchestra committee. That's an elected group of representatives by the other musicians to represent them. Keith's position here is kind of straddling both of those scenarios, where he's, yes, a musician, but he's also on the administrative side and participates in contracts in a slightly different way. And we're going to dive into all of that later on. But that's where we're at. And Zach, how long have you been with the orchestra?
I just celebrated yesterday my 5th anniversary.
Oh, congratulations. And I even like that you keep track down to the day of the anniversary. And Pat, how about yourself?
Yeah, like Zach, I've been on the board for 5 years here in Toledo and a year as chairman of the board. And prior to that, I moved here from Minnesota, where I was on the Minnesota Orchestra board.
And you kind of hit my question I was going with next. With board members, I also love to know where their experience and history lies outside of the organization that they're in. It's a very different life if you're jumping into an orchestra in a governance position, and this is the first time you've done that, as opposed to serving on other nonprofit organization boards or even another performing arts nonprofit organization board. So you've got the experience in Minnesota and here in Toledo. Anything outside of that?
It's a good question. I'm the CEO of a local company, the Andersons. We're an agricultural company, so we have nothing to do with music, and neither do I have a musical background in my career. I've served on several nonprofit boards and for-profit boards, so I have a good feel for governance on 3 local nonprofit boards now, and I had a good deal of experience with the Minnesota Orchestra when I lived in Minneapolis.
Terrific. And on that point, actually, in your other nonprofit governance roles, because this will be directly related to stuff that we're talking about later, have you had other work in a unionized labor environment?
Did in Minnesota with the symphony there, but here, no. So in the case of, like I'm involved with the Toledo Museum, we don't have the same number of employees, of course, right? We have more of a executive staff and security guards and people that take care of a museum is quite different than a symphony orchestra.
And you were on that board the same time as here at the symphony over the pandemic?
Yes.
Oh, that adds.
I have had a lot of experience in my commercial career with unions, of course, but not related to musicians.
Well, and I'm going to stick on you with this then, because I have another question that opens right up, is if you're used to dealing with unions in your commercial work, this is something that when I go in and talk to boards about, it's usually one of the fundamental things that board members who do have union experience outside of the nonprofit performing arts sector don't usually have experience with musicians in a unionized environment where the musicians really are representing themselves far more than they do during, a larger national union where a national bargaining collective comes in and does the negotiating on behalf of the employees. What are some thoughts on that on your end here?
Well, I think it's fundamentally simple that you want to treat employees the way you want to be treated, whether they're union or non-union employees. Have open dialogue, listen to their needs, discuss areas of challenge, which I'm sure we'll talk a lot about through COVID this last year. So it really isn't that different. It's just about having an open two-way communication and really understanding where someone is coming from.
Gotcha. Well, I'm going to pivot that off to Zach. Kind of the same question, because I know for folks who are regular podcast listeners, this is the second time you've seen Zach on the show. So you probably know a little bit about his history where he comes into the field from outside the field, let's say. And, what's your perspective on the unionized labor environment when it comes to negotiations compared to the rest of your professional history?
I'd say this is a really positive environment. When we negotiated our contract, our CBA 2 years ago, 3 years ago? Keith, when was that?
2 years ago.
Okay.
We're going into the third year.
It was a wildly collaborative process. And I think there was a lot of candor and trust around the table, which I thought was something I'd always heard about from the Toledo perspective, that the administration and the musicians were always fairly transparent with one another. And it was certainly something I tried to continue. But I got to say, even though I heard so much about it when we first started sitting down to negotiate that CBA, I was very impressed by it. And Amy, I know you were on the committee at that point. Were you?
That is not true. I dodged that committee.
Dodged.
I did, and then I thought, that contract's in place for 5 years. I can safely get on this committee in 2019-20, and that really didn't work out so well.
Now there's foreshadowing.
Well, I think it was actually interesting though, because I think because of that high degree of collaborative intent and assuming positive intent is the idea that we would walk into a situation like COVID with a fair amount of openness and willingness to discuss. We spent much of last summer going back and forth on what we were hearing and what we were concerned about and what we were learning, and it was a lot of knowledge sharing.
Keith,
Drew, if I wouldn't mind interjecting here, is that the experience I had coming here was quite unique because the Toledo musicians are amazing. They'll play anywhere, they'll play anytime. We ask them to do lots of interesting things, be involved in fundraising, play at churches, play at ballparks. Just phenomenal flexibility in working with management to help the long-term success of the organization. And a patriarch of my company, Dick Anderson, was a longtime patriarch of our symphony. And he always said, we just got to work together to make this thing work. And it seems like that's the difference maker between management and musicians in Toledo.
That's an even better pivot to go to Keith on a question, because the folks who we're hearing from mostly right now are folks who have like about 5 years with the organization. And one thing from a labor history perspective that folks with that amount of time sometimes get blindsided by and sometimes works in their favor, depends on that history, is there is history. And Keith, since you're in the self-described been there since Christ was a mess cook kind of scenario, what's the longer labor history picture with the group?
Remarkably unchanged. The culture was in the making when I came on board in the early 80s. The culture of we're all in this together was pushed very hard on me, that was what I was to expect and what I was to deliver. You mentioned that I sort of straddle the fence, and the orchestra here in Toledo has always had musicians on the staff, and that was an important piece. Well, they haven't always, but the fella who hired me was a personnel manager at the time, general manager later. He was the timpanist in the group, and I think he firmly believed that if musicians were on staff and staff was in the orchestra, that it would be easier to be transparent, easier to buy into the culture, and it certainly has been for me personally. But it had roots when I got here, and we all, through past presidents and CEOs and right through now, and board chairs, and right through to Zach and Pat now, it has just continued, and we all see that it's successful. So there's no reason to change the culture that exists here in Toledo.
So just based on all this feedback I'm getting so far, this is just going to be a boring conversation because everything just went perfectly and smoothly, I assume, at this stage. Well, Elizabeth, is this the first committee experience that you have as a musician?
It is. I fell into the same, I guess, class of orchestra committee members as Amy. So I joined the orchestra committee my second season, so 2019, 2020, just in time for the pandemic. But kind of piggybacking off of what everyone's been saying, so this is actually playing with the Toledo Symphony is my first full-time professional orchestra job. So something that was kind of in the back of my mind coming into this is you just always constantly see headlines of organizations that don't have this good kind of connection between the musicians and the management. So I was like, okay, prepare myself, not necessarily because of COVID, but it seems like every orchestra ends up having something go terribly wrong at some point. And then I came into Toledo and then immediately hearing about this great history of negotiation, collaboration between the musicians and the management and the board. And I feel like I really saw that play out this past year.
Terrific. And now I think we're going to dive into things, but I also want to get Amy's perspective just a little bit, because you have had committee experience and you hopped off and then you hopped back on. Now that you're in the catbird seat of getting to hear what everyone else says first, what's your take on the broader labor history perspective?
This actually is my first time on the orchestra committee.
First, okay.
I have been on other committees, but not the orchestra committee. And I am grateful for the history and for the deep knowledge of my colleagues that I have drawn on quite a lot this year as we've navigated these uncharted waters. Everyone, the musicians I've worked with on the committee and even in the background on other committees are just so committed, and in this past year really treated it almost like a full-time job to make sure this got done and make sure that their colleagues were working and safe. So it is an extraordinary group. And you know, I'm a second flute player. The second flute player talks to the principal flutist, but generally not the music director so much, or the CEO or the chairman of the board. And so it was a great gift to me to get to connect to all of these different constituencies and to learn who they were and how deep their commitment is to the organization. So that's been a gift of the pandemic for me.
Okay, well, before you go off and mute yourself there's actually a follow-up. This is your first committee and your chair. There's always a story behind that scenario.
Well, it was a challenging summer when we negotiated that safety agreement, and it took a lot of time. And at the end of that, we had some committee members who needed to step down and take a break. And Elizabeth and I were kind of the last two standing on that original committee. So we provided the continuity from the group that negotiated the safety agreement into the pandemic year. And I have served on other committees, and I will tell you, I am constantly talking to other people and asking questions. I'm relying on everybody around me to make this work, as we have found over this year.
Well, that's a rabbit hole. That's an entirely separate discussion in and of itself, and I would love to come back at that. But I'm going to stay on topic right now. And we are actually not going to talk about the safety agreement component of everything that went on. I mean, that's been talked about, not to death, but it's been talked about ad nauseum, definitely, throughout the field. That's not what people usually are really wondering about. What makes Toledo stand out, and the reason why I invited everyone in, is because of how the organization determined you were going to approach ongoing artistic activity, which has all the expense elements added to it, the risk reward ratio, how it benefits the organization. There are groups not far from you who just simply shut down for the entire point in time. So let's go back in history to February, March of 2020, and everyone pretty much has a really good idea that things are really going to be shutting down. Zach, set up that scenario. Where was Toledo? What were you guys thinking? And had you even started into the process that put together your side letter agreement?
Not at that point, not in February, March. It was amazing. If we rewind the tape, we put together at an executive committee meeting, I want to say on a Tuesday, 5 points that we would consider going into shutting down the organization from public events. And by Friday of that week, we had a performance of Mahler and Brahms. We had gone through all 5. And that included excusing the audience and doing, at that point, our first live stream so that we would still be able to perform as an ensemble, but we would send that out, as we said at that point, as a gift to the world in a challenging time. And I look back at that performance, I'd love to hear what Amy and Elizabeth remember about it, but I felt like everybody was playing their hearts out because I didn't know we would all be back on stage together again. And the commitment to the organization and to music was so thick that week. And it was the last time we saw our music director, who got stuck behind a border for a while. There were a lot of lasts, but then over the course of the coming months, we had to figure out how we would get back to doing that again. And I guess if we start to think about how do we determine to do ongoing artistic involvement, I remember we made a commitment to musicians that we would get through the rest of the year. We'd honor contracts that were extended, including to supplemental musicians. This is before we knew about things like PPP, but we wanted to get to the end of the fiscal year and keep everybody on payroll because we understood that to pull the rug out from under everybody, it would really disrupt. And I felt like we needed to keep people safe. And that included giving them an income and the ability to at least keep their homes and their lives somewhat intact, even if we weren't going out and performing together. And then I'd opened up this.
Let me interject really quick there. Sorry, because there's an important part that you touched on that
Sure.
I think listeners are going to benefit from, which is the end of the fiscal year, which for nonprofit performing arts organizations, for you guys, I'm guessing is probably August.
6:30. No, June 30th.
Oh, June 30th. Okay, so even a little bit earlier. That's a key date, given what we're talking about here. So I don't want to throw you off track too much,
Sure.
but so you're making these decisions about end of fiscal year June 30th, which at that point in time, this decision making was when?
This would be in March. So I'd say that we're still going into the 4th quarter of the fiscal year. And we made the decision, we'll figure out how to get there, and we'll pay for it if we must. We have some investments that we would lean on. Fortunately, we didn't need to. We ended up having a lot of generosity from the community, a lot of donations of money and tickets and things like that we were able to repurpose to keep the organization floating through the end of fiscal, even though we weren't performing. But this was. I got a point in here, and I can't remember if I raised this last time we spoke, Drew, but we had just renewed our mission, vision, and values, which as an old marketing guy, I used to think was just a bunch of words on a page that people forgot about as soon as they wordsmithed for an entire week. But we had just figured out that our vision was to bring our region and our community together through the performing arts. And if that was our vision, I remember saying that we had to find ways to continue to add value, even though we had taken away this principal element of live performance. So it was a great point to come to the orchestra committee, to come to the orchestra, to come to management and think of ways to do that. So when we think about that last quarter, April, May, June, we spent a lot of time doing video recitals, all of those great simultaneous, quasi-simultaneous performances from people's basements and practice rooms, and that at least got us to feel like we were still an ensemble. But to turn it off was never part of our dialogue. And then as we went into planning for the fiscal 21 year, that was a little more touch and go. We knew how far we could go with current funds, and we'll see if we get any more. And we would reassess, and it just kept on going. So we got through the year.
And I think that's where the real excitement starts. Is okay, you got to the end of fiscal year, end of June 2020. Yep. And then there is, what do we do past this point? All right, so then now that's when the tightness in the chest factor starts to kick in a little bit more.
And I'll point out that was exactly as Pat, you were transitioning from vice chair to chair. So it was I've never seen a board chair run away as fast as your predecessor.
Well, then how and where and what point in time did the conversation about what ultimately became your side letter start?
Gosh, I don't remember the specific timing, but I want to say it was maybe in the April area. Would you say?
I think it wasn't that early, because I was kind of laughing today, remembering that we were planning summer programs. We were negotiating the side letter.
There was another side letter. You're right.
And the big discussion was, will the pandemic be over by July 4th? And we didn't mean this July 4th. We meant last year's July 4th. And of course, we were so wrong about that. But that was where we started. In April, that's what we talked about.
Right.
Interesting.
And that turned into, I think, what we had approved as up to 6 or 8 weekend performances through July and August. And that was really meaningful, because that's normally a time that our CBA is not active. But the musicians agreed, since we didn't play the last quarter of the season, that they would move those services into the summertime. And if we couldn't use them in the summertime, then they would just evaporate. And we were all comfortable with that. But I think that was a really great point that I completely forgot about, because it set up that sense of how can we do this, as opposed to should we do this.
And I'm going to pivot that over to Amy and Elizabeth, really, is the whole notion that Zach just tossed off that seemed casual, that anyone who's an insider in this business knows service conversion is anything but casual. So from the musician's perspective now on this, I don't know who started the conversation or where it went. It's kind of immaterial. But when the topic of something like service conversion came up, taking those services that you didn't do and then applying them to a period of time that usually is outside or violates the collective bargaining agreement in any other normal situation, how did that discussion unfold?
Well, it was in the context of having been guaranteed our income for the end of the season, and we were grateful and therefore I think willing. And another thing I thought many times in the last couple of days is a pandemic negotiation is like no other negotiation. Maybe different rules apply, but we had established trust, and there was gratitude for that we had been sustained through a difficult time, and we were very willing to talk about that.
And that's not an insubstantial point to gloss over, which is the initial action on behalf of the employer to offer to continue the payment through the end of the year. And just for clarity, was this 100% of what guaranteed minimum service payments were? Was it a percentage of that, or what?
It was 100%.
100%.
I think it included supplemental musicians as well, not just contract pay.
That's correct.
Terrific.
And Drew, if you don't mind me putting a little analogy in here, this is Pat Bowe again. I had an interesting experience in the 90s in the business I was in. We had a factory in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. They got completely wiped out with a flood. It was union workers. And we called them all together to meet at a local grocery store parking lot, because we were flying in to give them an advance of 2 months' salary, because we knew they were going to need it during the time of the flood. And the union all showed up, assumed they were getting fired, right? Because of that classic badge of union. And that gesture to say, we care about you, made the whole difference, right? So fast forward during the pandemic, I was experiencing the same thing in my company, where factories were being closed, but we needed to keep the workers employed to that benefits and income. And Zach and I had that same discussion. Well, we've had lots of financial troubles in the past, and most symphonies do, but boy, we need to be loyal to our musicians and hang in there as long as we can and do whatever we can to make sure people get paid and have benefits. So that was just the fundamental building block, right? Now, it didn't mean that we didn't know how long that was going to last, because we didn't know how much money we were going to have and how long it would be able to go for, right? But thank goodness for our donors and our patrons and people who stepped up that helped us get through it.
Well, Elizabeth, I'm going to come back to the other question, but I don't want to leave this because that's a perfect follow-up for let's be pragmatic, and I'll be the pragmatic devil in this one. Is at what point does that attitude or that perspective stop? Because not every orchestra started off with that idea of we want to try to support everyone, we want to try to be the good guys in this scenario. Some groups just simply immediately shut down and even tried to unilaterally, cancel their agreements and just claimed force majeure and said, nope, sorry, can't do that. There had to be, and stop me if I'm wrong, there had to be some level of discussion about that internally at a governance structure before a decision was made.
When we were approving the budget for fiscal 21, the 2021 season, I remember we went to the finance committee and said, give us a debt ceiling. How much money can we lose this season? And once we had that articulation that we would lose money and it would be a bloody season, but we would also make a go of it, because you have to remember, even in May, when we were negotiating that budget, May of 2020, Berlin Philharmonic was coming back on, Concertgebouw started doing performances. We started seeing these European orchestras start to make a go of it with socially distanced ensembles. Now, granted, a very different union structure, but we at least had a model that we felt like we could try it. There were a lot of things we had to have fall into place, just like that cat's about to fall into place. But we at least figured that we shouldn't just say we couldn't do it. So the question was, how much money can we lose? And it was I think something shy of $2 million. And then the role of management then was to get that number as small as it could be. You know, it was before we knew about things like second PPP or ERTCs or these other things that ended up coming our way. But when you go into it with that kind of a sense of we're in this to expect a loss, but we do that because we believe that this is the right way to go and we think it can be done. I remember thinking, man, if we can get to December of 2020, get through the holidays, we might be able to make a go of getting through the rest of the year. But in my mind, it was really, let's get to December and reassess. And by December, we were in a fundamentally different position.
Elizabeth, on that point, now that you're hearing this from this perspective, how much of this came through in the initial conversations with management in the post-June side letter discussion?
I think Zach mentioned earlier, the orchestra committee and management were really in constant discussion about something or other from the moment we figured out we needed to cancel those March concerts all the way. Really, it's still happening. We've just been constantly talking, and that's something that I think that's helped make it really abundantly clear to the musicians the level of support that the management and the board had for us. So in my mind, there was never a question of like, is this going to happen? Are they going to stand behind us for this season? It was really, how are we going to make it happen? So I think having that kind of reassurance throughout all of those months that we were in limbo over the summer and late spring, I think that really set us up well going into negotiations, because we knew we had that support of them honoring the end of our contracts through the previous year. We'd already had those discussions about possible service transfer. And the orchestra committee members, were able to sit in on the board meeting where they voted unanimously to approve that budget that had an allowance for continuing the musicians' salaries. So I think it was really encouraging for us to have all of that support.
That's a fabulous key detail. And actually, Zach, before you jump into that, I know Amy unmuted. She had something to say, and I stepped on it.
Well, I was just thinking, I mean, Elizabeth's absolutely right that the board's support of the budget and the season were essential. And there were other factors that were inspiring us. The IMA side letter was generous, and we knew we could create great content because we'd had cameras and big screens in our hall for a couple of years, and we knew we could take advantage of that. But really, I think it's in our DNA as a regional orchestra. We never asked, can we do this? We asked, how can we do this? And if somebody calls us from 3 hours south and says, can you bring us a Harry Potter concert? We say, sure. And if some church in the middle of Ohio says, can you do all Irish music so we can celebrate our priest? We say, sure. And so we almost never said, can we do this? We just immediately started asking how. And I think that's just part of the DNA of this organization.
Very yes and you use the R word, regional.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I know there was a discussion, and Zach, I'm going to out you on this, is when you and I were talking about this topic earlier on, is the whole concept of, well, are other orchestras going to find this as useful because we are a regional orchestra? Mm-hmm. And I'm a firm believer that all that's just ultimately bullshit. Decisions are decisions, and the things that people have to accomplish just have more or less zeros in front of them. The process that goes into getting to that end point is applicable. Someone shouldn't try to simply copy a process, but it's to know how a process was developed. And that's hopefully what we're uncovering in all this stuff. So, if anyone's thinking about that, which I'm sure some listeners are right now, it's Toledo, we're in X Big Five Orchestra, we're not going to listen to this. You're wrong, but also now you know why you're wrong. And this is more valuable to everyone from that perspective. So now, Zach, I cut you off. So what do you want to say?
I was going to follow up to something that Elizabeth shared. Is they were the orchestra committee was definitely in the meeting when the bloody budget, as I called it, was approved. But that I think is also a good example of the transparency that we've historically provided to the orchestra committee. Orchestra committee at this orchestra, and I know it's not this way everywhere, is invited to every finance committee meeting, every board meeting, every executive committee meeting. And that way we always feel like there aren't any surprises. So if we come into something like contract negotiation or COVID negotiation, everybody knows where the decimals are and how big the deficits are, the surpluses. So those aren't things that we have to go back and reconstruct from the beginning. And that promotes a lot more in this together concept. And I feel like all of COVID was really a good celebration of that, exactly for the reason that Elizabeth mentioned.
Celebrate. That's a good word. And let's celebrate the actual negotiation process, I think, at this point now. Keith, you've been very quiet sitting down there in that corner. And now you've got this dual hat role of the musician and someone who's working in a senior administrative position as the orchestra manager. When we get past this first side letter and we're into the post-June side letter, as the operations manager, a lot of this number crunching falls into your lap. Correct me if I'm wrong. But how does your role start to intersect with all of this before the negotiation talks even begin?
Well, it's very much a team sport. The budget, anything that we do is a team sport. And because the committee is at all of the meetings that Zach just mentioned, the team includes the committee when it comes to watching the budget and making sure that we're fiscally healthy. So it's nothing that one person does by themselves, although I'll take as much credit as anybody wants to pass my way. But then the negotiations began about if we can come back to work, because we were so successful at the live streaming from the word go. It was like, okay, we think we can do this safely. And so that's when that whole process began, and the budgets came out with small orchestras and the expense. I basically spend the money, and then there are, of course, other people who bring the money in through tickets or donors or whatnot. So my role in watching the budget wasn't all that difficult, because we were going from an 85-piece orchestra to a 30-piece orchestra. So by managing who was playing which services, and honestly, the first couple of months were strings only, and the budgeting was actually mostly good news every time I would turn a line in of expense. So it wasn't too bad. We needed to be creative, and honestly, the creativity was in the programming. And I don't know how much we want to touch on that at some point, but there was some genius programming happening.
Well,
Keith, do you
actually,
want to touch on the size of the core? Because I think that's a really important distinction, is that we had a large enough core that we had flexibility. And I think, if anything, we probably just used very few supplementals this year compared to other years.
Yeah, there were very few freelance musicians with us this year. We simply stuck to, we rotated strings, which was interesting, Drew, because we could have gone with just the core, but management and the players themselves, of course, thought that's not fair to the folks who are not members of the core orchestra to not be allowed to play all season. So everyone was standing in line with their hands up, put me in, coach, put me in, coach. And we did. We managed a rotation with the strings that allowed for all of the players to see a little bit of activity, if not a lot. So those were the sorts of things that were going on. And you were having people play services that might not be designed in their individual agreement. It might not be that they were to play that concert, but they were so happy to play. No one was reading the fine print in anybody's, individual contract or agreement. So it was just, it was a remarkable season, and we're just extremely fortunate at how the stars aligned for us to be able to manage our way through.
well, you've touched on one of the things that might be what I've seen in other orchestras in this process go through that tends to be a sticking point. And I'm going to throw this over to Amy and Elizabeth, which is prioritization of musicians and right of first refusal. Since you guys do have a tiered structure, core and non-core members, there's also that potential conflict between those two musician stakeholder groups with each other. The composition of the musicians committee, the orchestra committee, was there a break between core and non-core players?
Don't believe right now we have a full orchestra member on the committee. Is that right, Keith?
Kellen is.
Kellen is full.
We have one full.
Yeah.
Who joined us in September on the committee.
Oh, but in September, so not during this process.
No, you're right.
That's right.
Interesting. So the entire orchestra committee was comprised of non-core musicians?
No,
The other way around.
core.
Other way around. Oh, okay. Terminology. Gotcha. So then what did those musicians on the committee do to make sure that they're representing the interest of their non-core stakeholder, their colleagues?
Well, there were many conversations about many things. It was many hours on Zoom. I don't know, somebody else want to jump in and respond to that?
Yeah, Elizabeth, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'll just kind of add on to what Amy was saying, because the core members and the full members, they're all part of our bargaining unit. So they all had a say in the process of ratifying a side letter. So both groups of musicians were in our discussions, in our Zoom meetings and all that from the beginning. And we, as a committee, we did try to be very mindful of, say, if a few musicians weren't able to attend one of our meetings, then we'd call them up and make sure we could have those discussions with them, make sure they were being heard, and make sure we were communicating what we knew at the time.
And it was such a unique time, and even after we had an agreed upon side letter and had ratified it, there were still, and as the season unfolded, there were still musicians who weren't comfortable. You can write whatever you want to write, but in a pandemic, there's going to be people with concerns and needs that just can't be subsumed by that. And to their credit, as that was happening, management and our music director made it really clear that they didn't want just any musicians on stage. They wanted the Toledo Symphony musicians on stage. And so we kept talking and kept adapting the procedures until we could maximize the number of Toledo Symphony musicians who were comfortable playing. And I'm so grateful that all of these parties were that committed and that open to just keeping talking and keeping working it out until, and we're still talking, because every concert there was some other thing.
Pat, that brings up a question that I've got for you, which is more of an expectation versus what actually happened scenario, which is, we've been talking about side letters, and even though that's maybe a little bit more of a jargony term here, is within a collective bargaining agreement, there are ways that you can amend them, and organizations have gone about that usually one of two ways. You can either amend the agreement itself, meaning the structural agreement either has clauses that are changed with time frames on them, or you can do what's called a side letter. You folks ended up at a side letter. Did you go into the longer side letter process? Did you go into that thinking we need to have a side letter as opposed to an amended agreement? And what were your thoughts?
Well, that's a really good question, because I'd put it this way: from the board's perspective, when we get into the details of the contract and side letters, we kind of leave that to management, right? Where Zach is really in the middle of all the details of that, and he makes a recommendation to us. We were thinking maybe 50,000 feet higher. How do we keep our head above water? How do we get enough income coming in with donors and ticket holders and keep people employed? So it was kind of, we were probably thinking too high, because, as you know, this is an industry it's tough to have Zach mentioned deficits and surplus. I don't remember surpluses. I think the side letter wasn't the most important thing. It was trying to keep performing and keep the business afloat, if you know what I mean.
I do. Although I'm going to toss that right over to Zach, because it's a geek enough issue that folks who are listening to this are definitely going to want to know why you guys went one direction than another.
Sure.
I think we, and this is, of course, only a question I can answer in hindsight. I think we, at that point, anticipated that this would be a short-term need, not a long-term need. So leave the CBA alone. We all liked the CBA that we had negotiated, a nice 5-year agreement. But on top of that, we knew that a lot of the adjustments we'd be making would be for the purposes of COVID, and hopefully, at least at the time, I think we were all sensing that we wanted to go back to normally scheduled programming as soon as possible. So side letter made a lot of sense. I think the only thing I could offer to answer the question you asked, though, is that there was a very brief point at the very top of all this negotiation where we had a question as to whether safety protocol that we were in the process of or just beginning to negotiate, whether it required a side letter that would be ratified, or whether we would exercise this through the management rights clause of our CBA to provide a safe offering for our musicians to perform. And that was, I think, a conversation we had once, maybe twice. I know, Keith, you might remember this better than I do, but once we were in the term of side letter, then we knew we were trying to move toward ratification at some point in the summertime.
Keith?
Oh, sorry, I didn't realize that you were waiting for me. No, I would agree. And management rights, to me, feels like a wedge, that be like, okay, yeah, you can go that route. But when we talk about the culture that is the Toledo Symphony, it was like, gosh, yeah, you can do that, and you may win the battle. But as far as, the future of this organization, probably not the way we want to go. So I think, like you say, we discussed it maybe once, maybe twice, but it really didn't fit our MO here in Toledo. I don't think that it would have been successful in the long run. I don't think we'd still be in business if we had forced things in some way or another.
And I'm going to jump right back on one of those words you used, because I love words that people use. Wedge. It's a wedge. I think I got a little bit out of that, but describe what you're thinking about when you use the word wedge.
Well, it's something to divide something apart, and we're clearly a unit. We're all, I mean, it's cliche, but we're all in this together, and that's been said. I've said that more often than not over my entire tenure here, pandemic or not. Negotiations, regional concerts where the bus breaks down, whatever. We're in this together. And so when the pandemic hit, it was like bigger, badder, but we're in this together. And together, it's like I say now, after a year of hearing these things on commercials, we can do this together. We're in this together. We're all in this, all that stuff. I hate to go there and I apologize, but it just always feels that way. It has always felt that way. That comes from having, it comes from my being on the bus when it breaks down, not just sitting at home in front of the fire when the band breaks down on the road. And so the idea of driving something home so hard that you make enemies within your own family like this, it's just not good wisdom. It was interesting. I was listening to Elizabeth a little bit ago, and she had one sentence that mentioned we. It mentioned us, and then they, and then by the time she got to the end of the sentence, she said we, and it was like so perfect that is Toledo. It's like, yeah, you've got the us and you've got the they, but at the end it's we. And it's just we, I guess there's we and wedge. So, be careful, because there's also edge and wedge, but by the same token. So I'm going to stop using words. I've used up too much time.
Oh, not at all. I think we're actually picking apart good pieces with this, because what we've hit on here is one of my favorite parts in process, which is choice. And you've reached a point where you have to make a choice in the process. And this choice was, do we want to use the management clause, or do we want to actually explore a side letter? You could have gone in either way, and it was a conscious decision based on the factors that you're talking about now that led to that decision of let's explore the side letter. And so now we're at that point in the process. There was a lot of good, healthy history, it sounds like, in the past that helped lead to that direction, but people still had to discuss it, and they had to make that decision. So now that we're in the actual process itself, we learned a little bit, talking to Amy and Elizabeth here, about how they had to work with their colleagues to represent everyone to get to the end point in this process, and what you went through to get there. Tell us about some of the lessons learned. Are there things you would have done differently, or are there things that were just more difficult to work through than others, but you ultimately made it through to share? And don't everyone speak at once.
Sorry, go ahead, Amy.
Well, I do think it was unique because it was a pandemic, and
Yeah.
even as we were negotiating, every week we were getting information about instrument covers and HVAC and all of that. And even as we were negotiating, we were learning and discovering new ways that we maybe should be protecting the musicians. And I think that probably made it unique. Zach, you wanted to say something?
I was going to say the same thing. Just given the amount of time we negotiated, it went for several months, many meetings, and the point that I was going to say is that across that time we were learning new things every week. When it came to things like, there was a great photograph of, I want to say, the U.S. Marine Band performing in like little cubicles around every musician. That was, suddenly the gold standard to which we would aspire. And then a week later, they said, well, actually, no, those things inhibit the flow of air. So, plexiglass is to be avoided. And, we were just about to hit go on an order for a lot of plexiglass. So, having the candor to realize that none of us understood exactly how to do this, but we had to build comfort. And I think something that we're all saying through this conversation is the value of listening. And for the same reason that we didn't exercise the management rights clauses, we had to collect agreement and alignment, and we knew that was going to have dividends down the road, given the tricky terrain ahead.
Gotcha. And for folks listening, what was the term of this second side letter?
How long did it take to negotiate?
Oh, no, I'm sorry. How long was the side letter? What period of time did it actually cover?
covered from the beginning of the contract year, so just after Labor Day all the way through the end of fiscal, unless it was deemed appropriate to amend it or cancel it by the orchestra committee management.
Gotcha.
Because
So,
we optimistically thought that COVID would be over very soon.
well, that's the first one. And I'm thinking of the second one.
No, that's what I was talking about, the second one.
Oh, okay.
The first side letter was just for the summertime. It applied to performances in July and August and would expire at the end of August.
Okay. So then, for example, like right now, are you still operating under the terms of any of those side letters?
Not at current point. So we're back to normal CBA
Okay.
at this present juncture.
Fascinating then. So it sounds like the side letter, the second one expired just at the end of August?
First one expired at end of August. The second one began in September 2020 and went through June of 2021.
Gotcha. Okay. So just about now, actually, last month it expired.
Right.
I have to keep coming back to this. During this entire period of time, from the summer through where we are now, summer of 2020 through where we are now, the orchestra is doing all this artistic activity, and the musicians are also still being paid 100% of what they would have been paid. I see,
102%.
102%.
200
A fair distinction of 102% of what they would have been paid otherwise. And I want to let everyone who's listening and watching this to just kind of let that sink in. You know, think of organizations and news headlines that you've seen of other groups that have not had this sort of experience. And, you know, Pat, jump in anytime and stop me if I'm wrong. It has not appeared to sink the orchestra in any way, shape, or form.
No, and it wasn't without challenge. And
Oh,
it's
yeah.
one thing that Keith talked about. We've been sharing the information on our financials with our musicians for long before I was here. We all know the struggles we have, like everybody is, in fundraising and selling tickets and getting donors. We have amazing ticket holders and donors who stuck with us during COVID, rolled that money over a year, corporate sponsors who hung in there with us. And actually, a lot of our long-term donors stepped up during these tough times. We would not have had PPP funding or other external mechanisms, we'd be talking about a different story right now, because that's just the facts. And I don't want to be a downer about it, but if we would have been drawing those severe deficits, we would have had a different story to talk about. And, knock on wood, we got through it, and we hopefully don't have to do that again. But that is a good thing to say. We were employed, though, and thus we qualified to have PPP funding because we had a payroll. And
Good.
Looking back, that was a pretty good decision.
Absolutely. And from your role as the person who has to motivate your fellow board members to go out and do the additional fundraising during such difficult times, how did this process and the resulting agreements and the ongoing activity, how did it impact motivating board members and also motivating donors?
Yeah, I'd say it's difficult because we're probably no different than many other communities across America. Our town was struggling, right? People lost their jobs. Our schools and daycare centers were struggling. I mean, it was difficult. So there's a lot of people asking for money, right? And the performing arts that we represent and other arts organizations said we need to keep these organizations alive. The performing arts is critical to this community. And I think the long-term principal donors to this organization understand that. And they want to play the long game, right? And stayed in there with us. So it's not that there weren't needs everywhere in this community, and there still are, as we work through all the aspects of COVID impact we felt in Toledo. But the arts organizations were able to survive and get ready to thrive into the future.
Excellent. And something Zach said earlier about why they chose the side letter and didn't want to go with long-term changes and lock themselves into those sort of things. Amy, Elizabeth, I want to throw that question off to both of you, but kind of fork it in a different direction. Was there anything that happened during the side letter, lessons that were learned that you do as musicians and as a committee are discussing about potentially wrapping up into the collective bargaining agreement? Spoiler, sorry.
Sorry, what was that?
Spoiler alert.
Spoiler, yeah.
Oh, I mean, I think it's a little early to know for sure yet, because I think Zach said earlier, we just finished our second year out of 5 in our current CBA. But from my perspective, I feel like that's actually a really great thing for our organization, because now we've written this side letter with these protocols, and we've lived through that, and now we're working on transitioning back to our more normal mode of operation. So by the time we come to a point where we're at the negotiating table again, we're going to have these years of reflection and having that insight and having the hindsight of what did we do during COVID? How could that make things better possibly now? And by the time we reach the table, I think all of us will have a good understanding of things that may or may not be useful to bring to that discussion.
Amy, what do you think?
Well, when you ask that question, I flip it in my head, which is in this year where we had created this really great CBA, and yet sometimes it was nearly impossible to follow what was prescribed in the CBA. In a year when there's so many extenuating circumstances, and so you might get music on your stand 3 days before the first service, and maybe that's only 4 days before the first concert. And maybe it's music you're not familiar with at all, because we were doing unusual repertoire. That makes me really appreciate and value the CBA, and I'm so eager to get back to that line in the CBA that says the music will be on your stand 3 weeks before the first service. It's not in the CBA, but we have an orchestra relations committee, which is a group of trustees, a subcommittee of the trustees who meet in a regular year with the musicians periodically, just to hear directly from the musicians what their concerns are. And this year, we were in conversation with them a lot. And Marna, who is the chair of that committee, was so wonderful and generous and wise and thoughtful. And so if I could slide something into the CBA in the future, I would make Marna chair of the Orchestra Relations Committee in perpetuity. So and help me.
I'm going to write that one down.
It's always good to volunteer people when they're not in the room.
I hope Marna listens to this podcast.
I have one, Drew, if I can jump in.
Oh, please.
There's something that I was pleasantly surprised by. I'm sorry, things just fell over here. We're good. There was something that I was pleasantly surprised by, which is the change in uniform. We went away from tuxedos and full concert dress, simply because people to more reasonably wash their clothes between performances. Hope that happened. But there's something to be said for making the orchestra more casual. And a lot of audience members reacted to this. And, whereas the tux and tails was part of the battle armor in days of yore, it's not the audience that we serve anymore. And if we really want to be relevant, I think that it's an interesting time to reconsider our attire. So that's a conversation we haven't had, but I'd love to know what we're going to wear next year. See what that does to our ongoing comfort and communications.
And boy, they just couldn't have dovetailed nicer into the last question I've got on my list here, which is, what sort of ongoing analysis and plans are you really considering to integrate any of these elements into the CBA? So that pretty much answers one of those big ones right there, the dress code. And that's, boy, another great topic. It's actually on season 2 of the podcast. That's actually one that is planned. So I'm going to resist the temptation of jumping on that rabbit hole right now. But Keith, from an operational position, since you're the person who works more in the getting things done realm, what about this question in your aspect, now that you can look at it from a musician who has to live with those decisions and a person who has to help put those decisions together? What are the learnables that you would like to see evolve into something that's more long-term?
Oh, sure. The dress code would be number one for me. I think khaki shorts and tank tops. I'm all
details,
for it.
Details.
Details. Yeah, the do away with details, the tails, the tux and tails. No, yeah. I think it's interesting because, the conversations over since maybe the turn of the year, January, February, people have been, on stage. We've been talking about, boy, I'm getting kind of used to this outfit. We went to pit black, which is basically a dress, black shirt and black slacks and blouses, whatever. And it did allow you, it's funny, as a percussionist, boy, I can't stand jacket sleeves because your mallet sticks get caught up in the jacket. You have to use rubber bands to keep your sleeves back. And it's just, you rehearse all week in, a sweatshirt, and then you come to work to do it for real, and you've got this goofy outfit on. So aside from Zach's comment, of course, that it's not really the audience we do anymore. From a nuts and bolts standpoint, the outfit is one that I'm happy to see change, and I'm preparing schedules for September now, and all 4 of the ones I'm working on have pit black until further notice. That's a discussion we'll have, of course, before those schedules go out. But there was some conversations about things, and some things went really well. I don't think, the length of rehearsals have been much shorter, and of course everybody's all about that. Let's rehearse for 45 minutes instead of 2.5 hours. But to what end? So there are some things, though. The idea, as Elizabeth says, we really need to let the CBA run its course. Otherwise, you're talking about opening the CBA, and that's something you'd kind of try to avoid, because things can go a little bit sideways if you actually open up a 5-year agreement to make even what seems like a sensible change. All of a sudden, the gates are open and the dogs run wild. So you have to be careful about opening a CBA. But we're always open to, all of us would do what's necessary to keep things flowing smooth and comfy.
All right, I've got a wedge for that statement, though. which is, yes, you don't want to reopen a CBA unless you absolutely have to. That really is, kind of, weapon of mass destruction, last resort sort of thing. But if you're looking at an additional 2 years maybe before you start negotiating, 3 years left on the existing term, is there anything you don't want to lose that either employer or employees are excited about, that you'll see as a positive learnable from this experience, that you would like to see not lose steam or just simply get lost to time?
Well, the live stream, we would need to negotiate, and this is a little above my level of thinking, but the live streaming that we're able to do with the current environment, I would love to see the current environment of live stream possibilities survive. And maybe our CBA could envelop something that would allow us to keep reaching out to other countries and other states instead of just who's in the hall for us. So I think that would be like top on my list, aside from the dress code.
Thank you. I've been waiting for someone to mention something about streaming and live streaming. So we're finally here at the end, but that's good. That's excellent. Anyone else thoughts on stuff you don't want to see, die in the interim?
There are things, but I think they're not CBA things.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Like, what are you thinking?
Well, we explored repertoire that we don't often explore, more Baroque, perhaps, more chamber music. We also blurred the lines between our distinct series a little bit more, masterworks to chamber. And I think that flexibility in programming and personnel and all of that, it'll be interesting to see how that continues. When we couldn't get our soloists here, our principal players stepped up, often on very short notice, and showed us what great soloists they were. We knew it already, but they showed us again, and I'm sure we will keep putting them in that role. I hope we do, as we move out of this pandemic.
Fabulous. I think maybe I'm going to throw the last little bit here to Zach, because you're now the person who's going to be responsible for kind of pulling all this together. Amy's comment about blurring the lines of repertoire, the dress codes, all this stuff. What are you doing as the person responsible for making sure all this stuff gets tracked so that you analyze what kind of impact it's having on revenue and engagement?
I think that the hard thing is to draw direct conclusions of anything that we did last year, just because the revenue opportunity is so much different than what it will be hopefully in the coming year. When we look at what we've done from a programming standpoint, I don't see as much blurring of chamber music and orchestral repertoire on our Masterworks series, for example. But we have kept our chamber series in our typical concert hall as opposed to performing it at a city club downtown. And that creates the sense of occasion equal to Masterworks repertoire for something that's a much smaller ensemble. So I think we'll see some similarity, if not direct alignment on a particular program. As we look to the future, I think that by having stayed in the game for the last year, what that buys us right now is we don't have to get back up on our feet, reinstitute some sort of bond with the community and dust ourselves off. We can continue picking up steam. So if I have any hope for the coming year as we truly come back to normal, I think this will still be a bridge year to normal. If we look at 22, 23, that might be the first normal we really get to. But this will certainly feel a lot more normal. I want to find a way that we can take all of the community engagement we did through having virtual programs and continue to step that up and take music into different parts of the community. It's something that we've always done, and we've always done pretty well. But I want to add a lot of opportunities for listening and for different types of engagement than we've traditionally offered. So, as I look forward to not monitoring, but measuring some of the.
I thought you were going to say monetizing.
Well, it'd be great to do that too. But as we look to measuring these things, we've crafted a new board subcommittee for community engagement, designed to look for 1, 2, maybe 3 projects throughout the concert year that we could seriously do. We put some parameters on it. Each project would have to have a community partner who would help us to create agency on a topic. We'd have to have very clear goals and the ability to measure success. And our hope is that if we do this for, let's just say, the remaining 3 years of this CBA contract, that would give us somewhere between 5 and 10 really great experiences that we can look back on our new level of repertoire post-COVID for making remarkable achievements in our community.
Fabulous. And I think let's wrap everything up with playing a game of Mulligan. Pat, if there's one thing you could go back and do different throughout this process in your role with this organization, what would it have been?
Well, just maybe enhance the communication earlier, right? We're all kind of in the dark, and I think because we didn't know what to say, and we probably should have said we don't know, and maybe got better communication earlier.
Fabulous. I'll throw it to a musician, Elizabeth.
I was actually gonna say pretty much a similar thing, just even more communication. And I was on the orchestra committee and a safety committee that was part of the side letter. So there was communication between those, and then communication with individual musicians, with management, all of that. So just communication. And I wish we could have had some of the scientific data that we got later, but don't know if that would have been possible.
That would have been lovely, yes, for everybody. Keith.
I would have retired in December of 2009.
There's still one of those wedge statements again.
No, right? Honestly, if I could go back to the December of 2019 and knew what was coming, I may have been so frightened that I would have run. But I am so glad to have survived this with everyone. It's just been an incredible growth for this organization, for me personally, and for the community. If I were to try to do anything differently, wow, I don't know. Maybe try to get more sleep so I was better prepared for every day. But I don't have one thing that I would change. I wouldn't change anything, because the stuff that, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And Drew, I got to tell you, I am freaking strong these days. And only because of the support everybody here and everybody that we all represent, the musicians and the staff and the board, everybody. So I got nothing to change. I'd leave it all alone. It was fun.
There we go. Amy.
I would get off of Zoom. I would sign up for the Hearts and Flowers Committee instead of the Orchestra Committee.
You guys have a Hearts and Flowers Committee.
No, but I like the sound of it.
Oh, okay.
But Pat and Elizabeth speak my mind. I would have widened the conversation earlier, because there are many wise voices, and the more you listen, the deeper it goes.
Excellent. That just leaves you, Zach.
So if I look back to a year ago right now, I remember having a fear, and I probably shared it with everybody on this screen, but I was concerned that by going out and doing a season, that it might not move the needle. What do we do if we learn that nobody notices, and that the pandemic has distracted everybody, and this sort of salve for the wounds that we were hoping to put out into the world didn't matter? We took a risk that we might discover that the relevance that we've always presumed to exist might not be there. Now in hindsight, I couldn't disagree more with that fear. Even saying it out loud now makes me realize that the Emperor's New Clothes was definitely here. We're pushing forward so hard. We're lobbying. We're trying to collect alignment and agreement. But if that fear was ever there, that's shame on me, because it's been a great experience since then.
I like how you worked the Emperor's New Clothes into the whole dress code discussion earlier as well, too. That's very good. Very, very good. Well, I want to thank my quintet of Yes, quintet. Oh, my goodness. It's been a long day. Yes, my quintet of guests tonight. And the cat is reminding me that it's late and time to be fed. So I'll let everybody go. Thank you for your time. I think this has been fantastic. And for everybody listening, I hope this has certainly put good thoughts into your head and helps your situation where you're at and moving forward in a positive way. Thanks for listening, everybody. Bye-bye.